Thanks everyone for coming in today. I'd like to introduce Danielle. Danielle is passionate about empowering people to live healthier lives with the help of novel technologies. After studying biomedical engineering at Johns Hopkins University, she has gained a wealth of experience in the SaMD industry, first as a reviewer at the US FDA, then overseeing regulatory quality, clinical validation, and research initiatives at both WellDoc and Apple, and finally now as a director of quality and regulatory at Kintsugi. Thanks, Danielle, for coming here today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to connect with all of you and get through some of the tips and learnings I've gained along the way in my career so far. So I'll present on how to overcome regulatory hurdles and launch your SaMD or software as a medical device to market faster. But I encourage questions and comments along the way. I know there's a dedicated session and I'm looking forward to hearing about all of your different experiences and thoughts. And I want to thank Ina for organizing this and inviting me. It's always good to connect, even though it's virtual, hopefully in person one day.
One day.
Okay, let's go through the agenda real quick. I'm just going to introduce myself, although you've heard a little bit about me already, and talk about Kintsugi, where I work now, just to give you some context into the product that we are building. I'll walk through some disclaimers and then talk about strategies to get products into the hands of real users in the US, and then conclude with some tips and learnings, like I said, that I've gained along the way. So again, I'm Danielle. I'm the director of quality and regulatory at Kintsugi. I was previously at Apple, WellDoc, which is a startup that makes a class 2 diabetes management app, and of course, FDA as a reviewer. So I've just put some images of some of the things that I'm really proud that I got to work on and grateful for the experience. So the Apple UCLA study was kicked off a couple of years ago. And in that study, we were working to collect data to build objective markers for depression, anxiety, and stress. It's still ongoing, but there is some public information out there that you can read through some of the data types we're collecting and the efforts in that space. The ECG app on the Apple Watch. So this was Apple's first regulated SaMD product, and just an amazing experience to be able to work on that. I do have an image or a screenshot of the Blue Star app. So that's WellDoc's diabetes management app, like I mentioned, where you can record glucose, you can get some guidance on your daily meds, your meals, fitness, etc. So a very robust diabetes management platform. And then, of course, just recognizing FDA and CDRH, where I started my career. So quickly, I want to talk about Kintsugi because I think it's really cool and it may be relevant to some of the things that you're working on. So at Kintsugi, we're building voice biomarker AI software that can detect signs of depression and anxiety from short clips of free-form speech. The software is language agnostic, so it's not about what the patient says, but rather how they say it. We have a model that represents over 40,000 patients, and that continues to grow. The software is system agnostic, so we're building an API that can plug into different types of platforms and apps so that it can sort of cater to what the clients need. And then, as I mentioned, we're really looking for free-form speech. So we don't require the patient to answer any specific questions or read through any specific text, but really it's the insights gleaned from a more casual conversation with their doctor or provider. I should mention that the device is still under investigation and we do not have FDA approval or clearance quite yet, but hopefully that will happen in the future. So some quick disclaimer. Oh, yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Oh,
I,
yeah.
I didn't know that it was language agnostic. Can you talk a little more about like what kind of markers or like inflections or how is it
Yeah.
language?
Exactly. Yeah. So it's not NLP. It's really about the pitch, tone, speed of how quickly or slow someone speaks. There's a lot of research out there actually on voice biomarkers and detection of depression and anxiety from those biomarkers. So we're leveraging a lot from the research out there to build this model.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, it could be a really robust solution to, just the rising rates of depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues in the US and around the world right now. So it's a very mission-driven company, and I think could make a big splash in this industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you need like baseline recordings from that particular person to be able to normalize, or does it work like cross-sectionally?
Good question. The goal would be no, that we would be able to sort of opportunistically collect speech from any given maybe telehealth or phone call encounter. We're still working on the details there, but that the idea is not to have any sort of baseline or pre-visit to be able to understand the person's kind of like talking speed or pitch or in a normal scenario.
Wow, that's very cool. I'll stop interrupting you. Thank you.
That's okay. We can definitely talk more about Kintsugi. I'm happy to. Okay, so yeah, just some quick disclaimers, nothing formal, but I'm really speaking about the United States only in this presentation. That's where my expertise is, and mainly class 2 or lower risk SaMD products, because again, that's where my experience lies. Always double check guidance based on your product and your particular scenario. Consult with FDA or other regulatory experts. Just to make sure that you're using the guidance or regulations as applicable. And finally, I'm not a software engineer, so my vision of building software products definitely should be vetted by experts. So bear with me on this journey. I want you to think of your SaMD as a sort of puzzle with different pieces that make up your product. So I just threw up an example of, some of the SaMDs I've encountered along the way or that I've worked on myself and put them together into this sample SaMD. So you might have a daily journal, you might have educational content and learning modules. You may transfer data to an electronic medical record or some other central repository. Your app might sit on a general purpose computing platform like an iPhone or Android. But really at the heart of it is usually, at least in my experience, some sort of condition detection or management algorithm or algorithms. So this is typically regulated depending on the types of claims you want to make, and is likely going to be kind of the focus of your regulatory and quality strategy, whether that's clinical validation, your regulatory submission, etc. It's also likely what FDA will focus on and scrutinize, not in a negative way, but focus on in terms of your documentation and submission. So for example, how well does your algorithm perform? What's the risk associated with the output, et cetera? Just the typical regulatory questions related to these algorithms. So we're going to focus in on this particular piece because, like I said, it's likely that if you're making claims related to a specific condition like anxiety, atrial fibrillation, heart attacks, skin cancer, diabetes, you name it, you're likely going to have to engage with FDA at some point. However, there are ways to release this type of algorithm without necessarily the burden of a regulatory submission out of the gate. with, of course, very, appropriate controls on the use of the product. And I'll walk through some of the strategies that I've either seen with other products or that I've worked on myself to get these types of algorithms into the market. So let's talk about some of these strategies to release your algorithm and get your product into the hands of users. So let's start first with the public API. So this is a lot like it's similar to what Kintsugi is building, not necessarily for this particular purpose, but the concept is the same. An API, if you don't already know, can provide access to features or data when integrated into a platform. So I'm going to use an example from Apple, actually. This is Apple's movement disorder API. This API is intended to continuously measure and record tremors for Parkinson's disease for your app or system that it's integrated into. If you look up this movement disorder API on the internet and you find Apple's informational website, you'll see that they're very clear that they have not received regulatory approval for this product. And it's the responsibility of the manufacturer who leverages this API to go through the appropriate regulatory steps. So you have companies like Rune Labs, which do in fact leverage this API to build out their regulated software. I think it's called Strive PD. Rune Labs is the one who's obligated to provide FDA with the details needed to ensure their product works as expected with the integration of this API. So, validate their products, provide the information needed to show that the risks are mitigated to an appropriate level, et cetera. Rune Labs may have, a partnership with Apple where they can get certain information that's not public, or perhaps it's just a black box that they sort of need to formulate a development and testing strategy to, again, make sure that the API is working as expected in the context of their software. But from Apple's point of view, they are releasing the product and they're letting manufacturers use the API as long as these manufacturers follow the labeling on the website. And some other things like having a developer account and things like that are Apple specific requirements. But ultimately putting the onus on the manufacturer who is leveraging the API again to make sure it fits in the context of their particular device.
Can I ask a question?
Of course, yeah.
Since Apple isn't included in like the submission of the product to the FDA, and your product is using the API, and Apple at any time can change how a specific metric is defined and operationalized, how do the manufacturer and the FDA ensure that any future changes are, managed? And that they continues to perform as expected, as at the time it was cleared and moving forward?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And manufacturers should have a strategy for this, whether it's leveraging an API or using like Apple's OS or the Android OS, right? There are changes that come out unexpectedly. And so a manufacturer has to account for that by pre-planning, but also reacting to that release. I've seen in very serious sort of situations where the operating system, as an example, has changed significantly, a manufacturer would pull their product or disable their product until they can, build around the changes and make sure that they have followed their quality system procedures to ensure those changes don't introduce significant risks. I think Apple at least is pretty good about beta testing and developer programs that allow people to understand the upcoming changes without them being exposed to a user. But yeah, it's a really good question. Sometimes you're caught off guard, whether they have like a security flaw that needs to be updated, you know, in the next 5 hours. You'll have to assess whether that impacts your device.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll jump to number 2, which is a research tool. And I want to take a step back here and talk about the IDE, or Investigational Device Exemption regulations. So if you spend some time reading through these, you'll see that non-significant risk devices are exempt from many of the regulations, including approval by FDA before a study starts. They do require some abbreviated requirements for these types of devices, like IRB approval, consent, of course, labeling your device as investigational, and implementing some monitoring procedures. But this approach, when used correctly, is fairly low burden compared to waiting for your device to be approved or cleared. And so let me walk you through an example, and I think it'll help to understand what I'm talking about here. So I'm using, again, an Apple example. This project I actually worked on directly at Apple. It was the first project that I was assigned to. So it's very close to my heart. What we did was we released an investigational app on the App Store. So anyone could download this app. And what we did was we built our irregular rhythm notification algorithm into this app with a sort of wrapper UI. So this is what I mean by that is this is not the product we intended to ship, widely. It was more of a investigational study type product with the algorithm built in. So we had a way to assess eligibility. We captured consent within the app. And users were able to kind of go through that workflow to then get enrolled into the study. Once enrolled, data was collected, and if a participant's data triggered our irregular heart rhythm notification, they would receive a ground truth ECG patch to wear while they were wearing our watch, so that we could use this data along with our algorithms data to measure performance. And this was all in the context, again, of an investigational study. We had over 400,000 people enroll in the study, which I think is one of the largest cardiovascular studies ever. And this was all done through an app. We didn't have a site. Any time we mailed an ECG patch, it was kind of direct to participant. But we were able to sort of release our product in such a way that people kind of gain some insight into what this feature would end up doing, but also use the data to actually support our de novo submission for the algorithm. So again, this is a really interesting way. And of course, Apple has the reach that not many other companies have, but it's an interesting way to sort of package your algorithm slightly differently and according to research study regulations, so that you can get your product into the hands of users, get them to understand. I mean, this algorithm is a little bit hard to understand. It's pretty novel, or it was novel at the time. So we really wanted to get both the clinical community and users themselves to understand how it would work. And so our ability to release this type of app was especially helpful in that context. So just finally, the last one is general wellness. And general wellness is really meant to describe FDA's intention to regulate or actually not regulate that's sort of referring to what they call enforcement discretion. So as part of enforcement discretion, they're defining certain device functionalities that are deemed low risk and intended to help maintain a general state of health. as under enforcement discretion. So they won't require a regulatory submission. There are a ton of examples out there about general wellness. So if you're using a wearable and you're tracking your fitness, heart rate, all kinds of things. The example I pulled is the Oura ring, which is a wearable ring that that tracks not only sleep, but all kinds of activity, and is proven to be very useful in this space, especially because sleep has, as we know, such a significant impact on our physical and mental health. So Oura is tracking things like total sleep, time in bed, resting heart rate during sleep, etc. But all of this is sort of in the general wellness realm. They're not making any claims, for example, about sleep apnea, diagnosing or treating sleep apnea. And so they are able to release this product without, a formal regulatory submission. But this strategy is really great because you get your product into the hands of users. Maybe it's not the product that you ultimately intend to ship or manufacture in the long run, but you're getting, you're building a customer base. You're getting insight into how customers use your app, how they sort of take to the way you visualize their data. Perhaps, Oura, and I don't know what their product roadmap looks like, but perhaps they are building for sleep apnea claims eventually. And so this type of general wellness approach can help to gain, customer insight prior to having to go through the regulatory process and shipping a regulated feature. One other thing to note, if you read through the general wellness guidance document from FDA carefully, you'll see that you can actually make claims around particular conditions that are typically, regulated, right? So diabetes, high blood pressure, etc. As long as you're claiming to reduce the risk of certain conditions. So an example from the guidance is, promoting physical activity, which as a part of a healthy lifestyle may help to reduce the risk of high blood pressure. And that can be an advantage as well, because you're sort of creating your market in a regulated condition space without necessarily, building a product that is regulated. So it's a nice way to, again, build your brand and trust in your brand while being able to release your product directly to users. So I know that was a lot of information. Any questions before I move on? Okay, let's keep going. So back to the puzzle.
Sorry, I have one question.
Yeah.
This is Karen. So you mentioned about the IDE device that was released in the App Store. I'm not sure how you can release a device under a clinical investigation to the general public in App Store. Are there any controls within this strategy?
Yeah, for sure. So a couple of different things. We followed all of the abbreviated requirements under IDE. Our device was categorized as non-significant risk. And so I mentioned some of the requirements there, IRB approval, consent, etc. So we covered all that, not to mention when a user downloaded the app, there was a series of questions related to their eligibility. So, age, clinical condition, etc. And we were able to vet and sort of assess whether they were qualified for this study before moving them to the consent phase and actually enrolling them.
Thank you.
Sure. There's a couple other examples of this. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, sir.
Oh, yeah. So after the Apple Heart Study, Apple decided to build actually a research app where we kind of used the model of the Apple Heart Study, and we're able to have a collection of studies that people could enroll in. I think Google does this as well, and a couple other companies. So it's become sort of the norm to have a quote unquote research app that then customers or users can download and decide which studies they want to contribute data to. Go ahead if I interrupted.
Karen, I'm not sure if you have anything more to say. Please interrupt if you do.
Thank you so much. That's great.
My question was, you mentioned, like, for example, the Apple heart study was categorized as non-significant risk. At what point should you reach out during your product development phase to the FDA to kind of tell them about what you're building and start building a partnership or a relationship with them?
Yeah, so that can be probably broken down into two questions. I always say, like, start conversations early, because even if you think your device is going to change and evolve, building that relationship, understanding who are the people that will be reviewing your device, getting their feedback along the way is super, super important. And the Q submission process allows you to do that in a pretty informal way, honestly, compared to some of the other ways to interact with FDA. Ken can, of course, speak to all of this. But I think, like, the Q sub process has been extremely valuable in every company that I've worked with. And so I'd recommend doing that early and often. When it comes to non-significant risk, you know, you're the one who kind of has to decide whether your device qualifies for that category. And there's a lot of resources online that you can use to make that determination. The IRB will also likely, at least the IRBs that I've worked with, will likely ask you for that justification as well. So you will have to prepare that for some sort of reviewing body and get some, you know, concurrence that your justification is appropriate.
Is it ever too early to reach out to the FDA? Because I feel like there's a sentiment that if you reach out to the FDA too early, they'll get annoyed.
I mean, that's their job, right? The part, you know, I think, like, at least when I was a reviewer, I thought it was super exciting to see new and innovative technology in a Q sub. It gave us the ability to sort of help along the way versus just receiving a submission and not have had any sort of input along the way. And so I think it's an advantage for a reviewer to get involved early, or a review group to get involved early, so that we can sort of move along this journey together. In the Q sub, there's also a category for just an informational meeting. So you don't even have to have any questions. You can go in there and say, hey, we're building this product. We wanted to tell you about it. And FDA accept those types of submissions, and you're welcome to do that at any point.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. I never thought of it that way.
Hey, Danielle, can I share a story that I think might be interesting for the group?
Yeah, of course.
So, so I worked in the industry for about 20 years before joining the FDA, and many people in the industry had the same fear about reaching out to companies. A friend of mine reached out to me and said, Ken, I got this really strange call from FDA. They actually read about our product outside the US and contacted us and said they'd like us to submit a Q sub to come and talk with them about the product. So I think it highlights some of what Danielle is saying, is that the teams are very interactive now and actually would appreciate hearing from you. And if they don't, they might express an interest in your product and reach out to you and suggest that you submit a Q sub. And I just think it helps build that sort of bridge and helps them understand the products if and when you're ready to sort of take the next step. So thanks.
That's a great story. I haven't heard that one before. Yeah, so I think in a nutshell, the guidance is always communication early and often is helpful and important to build that relationship. Okay, I'm going to jump to the next slide. So again, thinking about our puzzle, what do some of these strategies look like in practice? And As I mentioned, I am not a software engineer, but I like to think of myself as a software visualizer of sorts. So thinking about the research tool, we still have our condition detection or management algorithm in there. It's just packaged differently. So we've maybe turned off some of these other features, but we've added the investigational device label, an eligibility check, a consent. It still lives on a general purpose computing platform, but it looks a lot different. And, you know, one of the big advantages here is that if your algorithm is, you know, consistent from the point of investigation to the point you want to submit to FDA, then your path is a little bit more clear, right? Because the data that you collected in the investigational study can then be used to support your regulatory submission. And then in terms of general wellness, perhaps you keep a lot of the same, you know, general wellness or non-device features and functionality that we talked about at the beginning, but your management algorithm is, or your condition detection algorithm is quote unquote lower risk or lighter. So maybe you're not trying to detect sleep apnea, but rather track sleep in an effort to live a healthier lifestyle. And so, you know, this is just, again, the way to sort of think about these puzzle pieces is you're building different versions of your product that can be released in different ways in an effort to ultimately get to your goal, whether that's a regulated product or some other version of your product that is sort of your, you know, North Star, or your ideal case. So I've talked a lot about these advantages, you know, the advantages of these strategies and this made up puzzle approach. But again, by modularizing your product, you have the flexibility to release in different ways in an effort to eventually get to your goal. So just to touch on some of these things, this strategy or this approach can provide you with a robust clinical validation strategy so that you can validate that your product works as expected with real users. And then again, use that data to support a regulatory submission. I don't know if I mentioned this, but publications are super important for startups as well. Startups, big tech, really anyone. And so, you know, for example, with the Apple Heart study, we were able to not only collect data to support a regulatory submission, but also publish and get the clinical community to understand the type of product we were trying to build and get them comfortable with the idea that, you know, patients may eventually come into their office with these types of notifications and sort of what to do with that information. Of course, we've touched on user feedback and data. You know, design controls and change management, I think we can probably talk about in a whole other session, but I did want to mention it here because I think that with these strategies, you can approach design controls in a way that's scoped for the product you're trying to build at that moment. So, you know, you should never really build design controls or a whole quality system around a product that you're not actually building. And so this can help you to sort of scope your approach to design controls that will eventually give you the information or source of truth for your future regulatory submissions. And then when it comes to change management, FDA has a lot of guidance on what types of changes need to be submitted versus which can be documented in your quality management system. So if perhaps your puzzle looks like just the green piece for your first de novo or your first 510K, and then you add on functionality that's you know, low risk or you know, for cybersecurity or features that are considered general wellness, you may be able to strategize a change management process that doesn't require, you know, 10 510K submissions after your first one. So just think about that in terms of modularizing your product. I hope that made sense. And then finally, brand recognition and trust. So we touched on this, but getting your product into the hands of users early, and maybe in a general wellness setting can give your users that brand recognition, and the industry that brand recognition. When you actually go and decide to move into the regulated space, not only will FDA approval or clearance help, but you'll also have an established user base that trusts the data that you're putting out. And then finally, this will be quick, but there's a ton of things to learn in this industry, and I only claim to know about 10%. I still have a lot to learn, but really what I've found is that the learning comes from experience and actually doing the job and going through these different scenarios to be able to apply those learnings to future products and companies. But my tips and learnings really come or sort of, thinking about the quality system and design controls, because, I don't think that people necessarily think about the quality system too deeply. And what I've learned in my experience is that the quality system really builds a foundation for everything else, whether that's clinical validation, your regulatory submission, et cetera. So, as an FDA reviewer, I never fully grasped what it meant to have like a functioning quality system, and the partnership with the regulatory strategy. And so I'm just going to go through some of my quality learnings, although again, this could probably be an entire session. If you're a software company that's interested in building a regulated health product, you're likely to have existing processes and procedures. So use those. A lot of times they're not very different from what is required by FDA. And so I would encourage you to look at what you're already doing, whether that's, a product development plan or bug remediation or whatever it might be, and leverage those when you're trying to build a regulated medical device or medical software. I mentioned this before, and again, it's sort of nuanced, but I want to drive home the point that you should really build your quality system for what is needed now. So if you're making a research tool, your quality system should revolve around that, and then iterate or evolve over time when you move to the next phase, whether that's a regulated medical software that you're submitting to FDA. So I would say, like, scope your quality system and again, your design controls for what's needed now. Another good example is don't build a hardware quality system for a SaMD product. And that's an obvious one, but sometimes, with the quality system, it can be so confusing and hard to sort of understand where to start. And so again, my learning has been, if you're building a research tool or a public API, start small and then build or iterate from there. And then design controls. I love design controls. I can talk about them all day, but the main thing to know is design controls are usually the main source of evidence for regulatory submissions. You could design your system in a way to feed into regulatory submissions really seamlessly. So I would take time to think about how you're going to approach design controls, what it looks like, on paper, and then what it will eventually look like in a submission, so that it's not, you're not, doing redundant work to get your documentation ready for a regulatory submission. And then in terms of, sorry, there's some work being done, if you hear background noise. In terms of, training and empowering your employees, I think this is an important one, because I think when people feel like they have skin in the game, they feel more ownership over the quality system, and they understand the why. And I've seen that be a really powerful tool to encourage people to commit to the quality system. And of course, leadership engagement. So leadership being involved in the building of the system, the regulatory submissions, the clinical validation, et cetera, is super important. And then my last learning is really just about continuous improvement. FDA is not expecting that you build a quality system and put it on a shelf, right? They want to see that you're improving and learning, introducing efficiencies, again, fixing bugs, improving your product. And so I would say, don't be afraid to update your processes with the appropriate documentation and justification so that your quality system fits, again, the product that you're building and, the development that, development and learnings that you've gained along the way. So always strive for continuous improvement, and don't shy away from it. I just want to, again, remind you of all of the FDA resources. I mean, this is just a sample of it, but the FDA website, I think, is pretty well done, and you can find a lot of information on there. I've pulled some of the SaMD related guidance documents, as well as the QSub program guidance, which we've been talking about throughout this presentation. And I would encourage you to read through these. I probably have read through general wellness like 50 times at this point, because I always learn something new. It's always a little bit different depending on the situation or scenario that I'm researching. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take any questions or have a conversation about any of the things that I've discussed here.
That was amazing. Thank you. Anyone in the audience have any questions? I have a couple of questions. I always have questions. Or Ken, do you have any questions?
Ken, did I say everything correctly?
Comments?
You're too funny, Danielle. You are clearly an expert in this area, given all your experiences. It's quite fine. No, I'm just thinking, is there anything that you would think that FDA could do differently in interacting with companies to help them feel more comfortable and help them feel receptive to their questions, right? Like, I think there's always a fear that you're going to FDA a little too early, or that you're not prepared and you don't want to look foolish in front of an agency that's going to regulate you. And maybe are there some things that you would give people suggestions to help address that concern?
Yeah, I come into this a little bit biased because I was there. That's where I started my career. And so the way I've seen things evolve over the past, 10 years has been really incredible. Like, I find that the materials that they put out, the sessions that they hold, are really, really helpful. And so my mission is to sort of just continue to communicate that to, people like this audience and the companies that I work for. I think I'll ask the rest of the group what things that FDA could do to make it, less scary or intimidating to go to them when you have questions or want to talk about your technology.
I think it'd be helpful to know who are the people behind the curtain, because we talk about the FDA as like an institution and not the humans behind and working for there. And you mentioned that these reviewers are actually interested in being a part of the innovation and what's going on and what's new and modern. So I think, like, if there was like, how many reviewers are there? Like, how many teams are there? Where do they work? Just seeing their faces, I think, would make people reduce the barrier to reaching out and realizing that there are humans here who are actually interested in what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good one. And I think I can only speak from experience that I was one of those people. And I tried to be as friendly and sort of open as possible. And I think as, new generations of reviewers come in, there's just so much interest in technology and understanding, the sort of nuances and details of a device. And so I think like that, that sort of hiring process and identifying people who are really just, they're engineers at heart, right? They're just genuinely interested, has helped to sort of spur this innovation within FDA to get information out to companies who are either just starting out or who need some guidance for their particular product. So I can't speak to, what's going on right now at FDA, but I can tell you that there are some really genuine and curious people there, like Ken, like myself, like a lot of the people that I worked with, who are ready to sort of take the journey with you. In terms of like how it's broken down, and things like that, I believe there are resources online. Yeah, I think Ken just sent that in the chat. So you can at least get an understanding of the structure of FDA and, what types of people work in each division or organization. There have been a ton of reorgs since I've left, so I don't really even fully grasp all of the different groups there, but, continuously learning.
Cool. I love that.
I'll share something that I do with people that I hear from industry. So it's not uncommon that I look someone up on LinkedIn and try to get a sense of their background. And I always encourage manufacturers to look for their reviewers on LinkedIn and see what their backgrounds are and where they come from. It's like you said, like making people seem more human, I think really helps build the connection. And it's not just one big, like amorphous FDA. They're individual people in teams that work together that have all kinds of different personalities and interests, and trying to get to know them, I think, is really helpful.
Absolutely.
I do also notice that like more and more FDA employees are at conferences, speaking on panels, etc. I don't remember necessarily doing that during my time there, but I do notice that more and more. And I think that's also super helpful to, reach out to them at conferences or, like Ken said, reach out to them on LinkedIn. We really don't have a lot to lose there, except for no response. So again, just remembering that these people are humans just like us and are curious and interested in getting your product to market.
I'm just reading Ken's message in the chat there. For the recording, I'll read it out loud. There are 8 offices. There are 8 health tech offices, a few divisions in each of those offices, and then teams in each division. Each team typically includes 10 staff. Wow, that's a lot of people. A lot of people at the FDA to make friends with. Does anyone else have any more questions?
I'll have one since everyone is so shy. Danielle, what would you recommend? Is there some opportunity for companies to collaborate and share information and best practices? I know the agency has done a lot to try to highlight 510Ks that have been cleared that are in this space to make it easy for other companies to find them. But I'm wondering what things are happening in terms of collaboration and cooperation in the outside world beyond the agency.
That's a good question. I don't know that there's any sort of standardization across the board about sharing information. And then I know that a lot of companies are perfectly willing to share and others are more closed off. For example, Apple, is definitely doesn't go out and share all of the useful information or experience that it's gained. So it's a good question. I'd have to think about ways to make that, a little bit more streamlined. I think a lot of it, unfortunately, is about people who are working at other startups that you can reach out to and share experiences with. Like at Kintsugi, we have a lot of people in the industry who have advised us and we are able to reach out to them when we have specific questions. So I think there are probably ways like this type of venue is a great way for people to network and kind of understand backgrounds and see how, you know, we could all help to try to, you know, encourage each other to get our products on the market. So probably more work should be done there. But again, I'd start with, like Ken said, you know, looking at de novos and 510K summaries on FDA's website for products that you might find are similar to yours. And be creative here. Like, you're not going to find something that may be exactly like your product. Like, for example, with Kintsugi, there's nothing like it on the market that has been cleared or approved. But we're trying to get creative about products that have already been cleared or approved that we can leverage learnings from.
Perhaps for a future meetup, the topic of discussion and the target audience could be startups that have something that they're just like almost ready for submission, and they could share their learnings or something of that nature, ideally in person. It'd be interesting to know like where geographically these startups are located, because we'd love to have something in person, but I guess we don't have the density, or we haven't found the crowd yet in Toronto. Or if I've seen like clusters in Boston, some in Toronto, some in Vancouver.
California too, obviously. But you're right, Boston has a big sort of digital health or health scene. It's interesting now with people sort of migrating around the US. For example, I'm in Utah now. My company is based in Berkeley, but we have employees all over the US and all over the world. So it's an interesting change in the way that people are working now and networking. I do see, you know, more and more conferences that are now in person, where you can actually have that, you know, in-person contact. But it's definitely an interesting transition to this new way of working and interacting with people inside your company and outside.
Yeah, exactly. We're preparing to launch a community. We initially thought of creating it on Slack, but we've decided to move to Discord because Slack is changing some rules around creating communities and such, but we're hoping to launch it in the next few months. But it'd be interesting to know like what kind of conferences various startups are going to, where you can meet people, because like you mentioned, because everyone's working remotely, it's hard to find clusters of enough density to have like a networking session where a lot of people will be there. Yeah, that'd be really
yeah, totally. You know, I think that I see a lot on LinkedIn. I'm connected to, you know, a lot of my former colleagues and people who are, you know, in the health space or even the venture capital space, investing in health. And so I see a lot of their activity and kind of gain a sense of where people are migrating to meet in person. I love the idea of a Discord channel. I think that, you know, I would definitely be a part of that and share insights. You know, I think for me, I spent a lot of time at Apple. And so again, like I said, we were not as transparent as now being at a startup where I can interact with more people, share my insights, and do things like this that really help to sort of help me understand like what people are asking for, what people are interested in. And so I'm sort of just stepping into this world of sharing information that is not necessarily public versus being sort of being required to only share things that were publicly available. So that's where my perspective is right at this moment. But opportunities like this again are super helpful for me to understand the sort of lay of the land.
last call for questions.
I'm happy to also chat offline. If you want to contact me on LinkedIn or through my email, I'm happy to have one-off conversations if there's anything I can do to help. Oops.
Oh, okay. Well, if there aren't any more questions, thank you, Danielle and Ken, also for your active participation. I really enjoyed your presentation and really learned a lot. I'm so glad you could make it today. And Ken, maybe we can have another event in the future with you as well. We could talk about design controls. I have a colleague here who's also very excited about quality systems and design controls, so maybe we can have a nerd out session about that in the future.
Yeah, to be clear, I mean, people like Danielle who worked at FDA and now work in the industry, I think provide better insights than people that just work within the center. It's just my experience that you get so much better, broader perspective when you're working in industry and you have to actually do the work versus just reviewing the work, I think is only one piece of the overall process. So I wish we could recruit Danielle to come back.
That would be interesting. I would consider it.
People are working remotely now too, Danielle. So.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Yeah, I mean, I think it was a really great experience to start my career there. And then to sort of have this, experience in industry would only help in becoming a reviewer again, so it's all about kind of like the experiences that you have at these different companies, and then being able to share that experience or bring that experience to your next opportunity. So yeah, let's talk.
All right, okay. Take care.
Bye.
Well, thanks everyone for coming today. See you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.